Most of my stories, them being horror stories and all, end in a death. But this tale starts with one, specifically the death of my friend, Alan. Alan and I met our freshman year at Howard. We were close then, bound together by our mutual obsession with comic books. We read them, traded them, and even made some of our own. I'd write, and Alan would draw. He was a talented artist, could sketch a supervillain like nobody's business, which meant my stories had to be just as good. We pushed each other like that. But after college, we decided to do another comic together, a real one. When we pushed too hard, Alan and I stopped talking. But a couple of years later, he reached out. He left a message on my machine saying he missed me. I never called him back. If I did, I would have known he'd been diagnosed with cancer. Instead, a year later, I got an invitation to his funeral. Life can be cruel like that. A few days later, I was in a cemetery on Plat-Eye Island, off the coast of South Carolina, trying to beat back some rough emotions. While my friend was being lowered into the earth, for me, things were coming to the surface. Things I'd tried to bury. Guilt mainly, and profound shame. Shame that I'd abandoned Alan when he needed me most, and let him die thinking I hated his guts. Now you may think you know where this is going, that Alan came back from the dead and haunted me. And in a sense, you're right. This is about a haunting, just not the kind you're thinking. Because the entity we're talking about today isn't some common ghost. It's something complicated and grotesque, with origins so cruel folks don't like to talk about it. And a long time ago, Alan and this wretched thing came face to face. You're listening to Run, Fool! I'm Rodney Barnes, and this is episode 38, The Plat-Eye, Part 1. After the burial, I was apprehended by two other mourners, roughly my age, a tall woman and a short baby-faced man. They introduced themselves as Isadora and Pete, childhood friends of Alan's. They invited me to join them for a drink, to celebrate Alan. And despite my guilt, or maybe because of it, I agreed. We passed the afternoon on Isadora's porch, pouring one out for Alan. Then a few more, and swapping stories. I'm not sure if it was the grief or the booze, but soon I felt like we'd known each other for decades. When the sun started setting, I noticed the landscape began to change. In the dimming light, evening shadows stretched across Dora's yard, and the old oak trees loomed larger. Somewhere, a mourning dove called out, giving the scene some uneasy music. It was around that time, Isadora and Pete mentioned that there was one story about Alan they hadn't told yet. In fact, they'd sworn not to tell anyone. I leaned in, sobering up quick. I can keep a secret, I said. Dora shook her head. They couldn't just tell it, Isadora insisted. To really understand, they had to show me. Listeners, if you've been with me long enough, you know my curiosity has gotten me into all sorts of precarious situations. So before I knew it, we were piled into a small boat on the Carolina Bayou, heading to God knows where. I laughed, a little nervous. What kind of story was this anyway? The pair shared a knowing look. Then Pete looked me dead in the eyes and said, "A ghost story." It all happened back in the 70s. At the time, Plat-Eye wasn't the tourist destination it is now. It was just a ramshackle kind of place with a dying oyster industry and a small yet tight-knit community of mostly working-class folks. It was just one of many sea islands off the coast of South Carolina and Georgia, a land of blue water and bayous old-timers called the Low Country. It was slow living there, so slow it was practically crawling. But that summer, Alan was restless. He was 13 going on 14, too old to be a kid, too young to be a man. But he'd already experienced more loss than most grown-ups. The year before, his father died in a house fire. It was a freak thing, but in a matter of hours it'd taken everything. His dad, their home, Alan's beloved cat, Coop. It had almost taken Alan too, but I'll get to that later. Suddenly, it was just Alan and his mom. They needed each other more than ever, but she checked out. Everyone's got their way of dealing with grief. That was hers. Alan felt like a ghost in his own house, so he spent a lot of time in other people's. You already know whose. That's right, my new friends, Isadora and Pete, or as they went by at that time, Dora and Petey Lewis. The two were cousins and opposites. Dora was a tomboy, the younger sister of a bunch of older brothers, and with the grit to prove it. Petey, meanwhile, was softer, an only child raised by their grandparents with a face as cherubic as a baby angel. It was the start of summer break, and the trio was hanging in Petey's rickety shed listening to the transistor radio and playing blackjack. And Dora, as usual, was kicking the boys' butts. When she won the third round in a row, Alan threw down his cards and said what they were all thinking. Now what? As you can imagine, there wasn't much to do in Tefusky for a pack of bright young kids besides shuck a hell of a lot of oysters or get into trouble. And our heroes weren't too interested in shellfish. Bored out of their minds, they wandered outside to find Petey and Dora's grandpa sitting on the porch staring at something past the tidewater. The kids squinted to see a neon yellow bulldozer shoveling piles of debris. "They're tearing down May Dawes' place," Grandpa Lewis said gravely. "Those developers paid her a pretty penny for her property, and I'm sure she won't be the last." The four of them watched the demolition together as Grandpa Lewis went on. "They'll probably buy up the whole island, just like they did Hilton Head. And I reckon they already got their eye on Little Pale." Little Pale was the unofficial name of a tiny isle just across the river. It was called that because A, it was small, and B, the place was as wet as a bucket of water, almost swamp. Nobody ever went to Little Pale. "It's not like anybody's living over there anyway," Alan muttered. "Nothing over there but gators." Grandpa Lewis turned to him, eyes gleaming. "That's what you think. But that little island over there is worth more than Tefusky and Hilton Head combined. And you know why?" The kids looked at him, curious. "There's treasure buried in that swamp." Petey's mouth dropped. Dora rolled her eyes. And Alan, he was already getting ideas. Grandpa Lewis kept talking. "As soon as those damn developers get a hold of it, they'll be even richer than they were before. That is, if they can get around the witch." Grandpa Lewis explained that a woman lived on that island, a healer who had gotten into some bad stuff, black magic. Anyone who stepped foot on her island to find the treasure risked being cursed or sacrificed. Apparently, the Little Pale Witch had killed all sorts of critters in exchange for immortality. Snakes, birds, bunny rabbits. "But do you know her favorite thing to sacrifice?" Grandpa asked. The three kids shook their heads. He grinned. "The children of Tefusky." Now you might be thinking, "Rodney, I thought this was a ghost story, not some Hansel and Gretel fairy tale." But before you start accusing me of false advertising, let me assure you, this is still very much a ghost story. Let me also say, legends have a way of breeding even more stories, and the Little Pale Witch, it was just the offspring of a much older tale. But Alan, Dora, and Petey didn't know that yet. Grandpa Lewis told them everything he knew about the witch and the treasure. They learned that the gold was buried deep in a cave on the farther side of the island, but because of the witch, nobody dared try to find it. Dora, of course, was skeptical, but Gramps swore on his mama's grave, and no Lewis would swear on the family matriarch and lie about it. He had to be telling the truth. The trio returned to the old shack where Alan proposed something that would turn their boring summer around. You already know. Going to Little Pale and finding that treasure. Petey looked at him in horror, and Dora looked at Alan like he'd just said the stupidest thing she'd ever heard. But Alan kept talking. Because if they did find treasure, he continued, it changed their entire lives. Here's the thing about Alan. His excitement was infectious, and he's persuasive. In college, he talked me into some crazy stuff. That mouth of his made him one hell of a wingman. Anyway, Alan pitched them hard. He started talking about their futures, How if they got rich they could leave Defusky. But not just for the mainland. They could go to California. The three of them could move into a mansion like the Beverly Hillbillies. Petey interjected. Alan was forgetting the part where they could become kid sacrifices for a murderous witch, or worse, get whooped. Dora shrugged. I'd rather risk it than be bored all summer. At least it's something to do. Petey's face fell and Alan beamed. It was 2 against 1. No one's going to get whooped, he declared. Because once we're rich, we'll be out of here faster than you can say Defusky. That night, they carried out the first part of their plan. Each kid told their respective guardian they'd be sleeping over at each other's homes. Then the next morning, they snuck out at dawn. They figured they'd have at least a couple of days before anyone realized they were gone. Remember, this was the 70s. Kids back then were free range, especially in a place like Defusky. The trio met at the old rusted water tower and compared supplies. Petey collected matches and a shovel. Dora had her oldest brother's old army gear. And once she'd gone to sleep, Alan had smuggled out a bottle of his mom's whiskey. The trio then rode their bikes, backpacks in tow, to Defusky's southernmost tip, right across from Little Pale Isle. They dumped their bikes and hopped into a dingy aluminum rowboat Dora borrowed from her other brother to go fishing. Or at least that's what she told him. Then they started rowing. It didn't take long. In 20 minutes, Defusky was already shrinking on the horizon. And in another 20, the kids were bobbing in the tide, staring awestruck at their destination. Up close, Little Pale didn't look so little anymore. The island loomed before them, saturated with some mysterious aura, as if they'd rowed their boat into another realm. The island was dense with ancient trees and humming with cicadas. They paddled slowly into the bayou, parting fronds of weeping willows as they floated. Finally, the boat hit sand. They climbed out and shared the same look. They weren't supposed to be here. They could feel it. And as if to confirm that thought, they approached a barbed wire fence with a rusted sign. It read, "No trespassing." I don't know about this, Petey began. But for Alan, rules weren't commands as much as suggestions. So he ducked beneath the barbed wire, and the cousins warily followed. It was just a few inches, but moving to the other side of that fence felt like a declaration. No turning back. This show is sponsored by BetterHelp. Face it, folks, we got a lot going on. Our personal lives, politics, anxiety, depression, virtually everyone I know is dealing with something. I've been in therapy for 2 decades, and I believe the cornerstone of health is mental health. I think what really can help more than anything else is a little therapy. Getting into our lives for real. Not the illusion of pictures or reels or memes, but really getting to the heart of the matter of the difficulties that we all share in a very, very difficult world. If you're thinking about starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist and switch therapists at any time for no additional charge. Stop comparing and start focusing with BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/run today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp, HELP.com/run. The trio picked their way through the vegetation, ducking beneath the branches draped in Spanish moss and stepping over vine-choked logs. The dense canopy created a shady trail for our young heroes, but the air was still thick with humidity. Alan wiped the sweat from his eyes and took a breath. The thrum of cicadas was getting to him. His head was buzzing, and Petey wasn't helping. Behind him, Petey was humming, something he did when he was nervous. He was halfway through the chorus of ABBA's Dancing Queen when Alan heard something, a distant clinking sound. "Shh," he hissed. Dora and Petey froze. The noise continued in a slow rhythm. Clink, clink, clink. The three looked around when Dora stared at a spot on the ground. "What's that?" she whispered. Alan followed her gaze to see a patch of dappled blue light. It was almost pretty, like church on Sunday morning when the sun comes through the stained glass. That's when something occurred to him. Without a word, he dropped his pack and started climbing the branches of a gnarled oak. The cousins watched as he crawled further and further. Then, he saw it. Hanging in the canopy with some old rope were blue glass bottles. They swayed in the breeze, gently clinking together. He scrambled back down to Dora and Petey. "There are bottles up there. Y'all gotta..." Before he could finish, Alan heard a snap, and the ground gave way under his feet. All three kids screamed as he suddenly dropped into the earth. Alan flailed in freefall until luckily he caught a sturdy root. Petey and Dora scrambled to pull him out. Grabbing each other's arms, they finally dragged Alan to safety. The kids sat, catching their breath. "What was that?" Petey gasped. Dora stood and peered at the edge of the chasm. "It's some kind of pit," she said. She turned to the others, eyes wide with fear. "I think it was a trap." The trio had no choice but to continue. They needed to cover more ground before dark. But now, every step they took on the island felt like a risk. As they trekked, they noticed crude paths machete through dense growth, and logs strategically placed to bridge wide creeks, and occasionally, more bottle trees. Something was becoming very clear. They were not alone. The deeper they forged into the swamp, the more the little pale witch felt real, and who knew how many more of her traps may be waiting for them. By dusk, the kids made camp in a small clearing. Dora set up her brother's old army pup tent, while Petey and Alan gathered firewood. Night was falling fast, and the island had come alive with the cries of a million tiny creeping creatures. Petey and Alan dumped their collection of kindling, and Dora struck a match. Alan flinched. He wasn't fond of open flames. Surviving a house fire will do that to you, but he tried to play it cool as the kindling sparked and sizzled. Seconds later, they had a respectable campfire. Dinner was a feast of hot dogs on Wonder Bread. The kids chowed down, and the day's strange events retreated into the shadows. But while Petey and Dora bickered and laughed, Alan was staring into the fire. If you've ever sat around a bonfire, you know there's something mesmerizing about open flames. But Alan wasn't just watching. He was remembering. As the flames danced, he saw flashes of it. The roaring inferno, the smoke, his father's terrified face. "Alan?" Dora called. "Alan, are you okay?" Alan tore his eyes from the fire. Petey and Dora were staring at him, concerned. He nodded, forcing himself to smile. The rest of the night, the kids chatted and laughed, while Alan drew cartoons in the sand. Drawing had always been a good way to distract himself. Eventually, they decided to turn in. The exhausted kids piled into the tiny tent, snuggled in like puppies, and fell asleep. Moments later, Alan was at his house, his old house, and it was burning. The smoke so thick he could hardly see or breathe, and barely audible over the inferno's roar, the desperate meows of Coop, his cat, trapped somewhere he couldn't see. Alan frantically searched for her, calling her name, and downstairs his mom and dad were calling him. They begged him to get out, to leave her, but Alan couldn't. Coop needed him. He wouldn't let her die. Suddenly, the window shattered. Flames licked the walls. Suddenly, Alan knew he was going to die. He stood paralyzed when two strong arms wrapped around him. Alan looked up to see his father, carrying him like a little kid. He hadn't been carried in years. He sprinted with Alan to the stairs, but the steps were already burning. Then, to the window, Alan's dad swept away the broken glass. "I'm going to hold you out," he shouted. "Then you gotta jump." Alan shook his head, tears falling down his cheeks. His father took Alan's face in his hands. "I'll be right behind you." Finally, Alan climbed out the window and his dad lowered him carefully into the night. He stared up at his father's face streaming with sweat, eyes filled with determination. Then he heard it, the groan of wood straining under a burden it could no longer hold. Alan watched fear flash across his dad's face. Then there was nothing but the hard ground and his mother's screams as the house caved in, with his father still inside. Alan woke up drenched in sweat. He dreamt it again. No matter how hard he tried to ignore them while awake, the memories of the fire managed to sneak into his nightmares. He needed to breathe. Really breathe. Alan crawled out of the tent and into the clearing. inhaling the damp air. He felt better, sleepy even, when he got goosebumps. Remember, this is the South where summer nights are almost as hot and muggy as the day. So that chill, that wasn't from a breeze. There was something there. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision. Alan spun around and froze. Up ahead, just beyond the swamp's edge, 2 white orbs penetrated the night. They were as wide and round as 2 small moons, glowing bright and perfectly still. Alan stared, struggling to understand what he was seeing, when they blinked. The next morning, Alan didn't tell the cousins what he saw. Instead, he shook it off, chalking it up to his overactive imagination in that creepy swamp. Maybe a remnant of his nightmare, but certainly not the little pale witch. Eyes like that were neither human nor predator. They were too wide, too curious. But Alan couldn't help but feel whatever it wasn't just watching him, but observing. They continued their journey to the far side of the island when the cave was said to be. Their goal was to make it there the next day, find the treasure, and be back in Tefusky before sundown. Motivated by the promise of riches and adventure and the fear of getting whooped, they pressed on at an impressive pace. As the sun faded, they stumbled onto a small beach where the bayou emptied out to the ocean. Exhausted and hungry, they decided to make camp. They poured the sand out of their sneakers and ate their supper. And as the twilight seeped into the night, lightning bugs flickered in the trees. Petey caught a few in a jar, and Alan passed around the stolen bottle of his mom's whiskey, and they all started talking about what they'd do in California. When we get there, Alan began, the 3 of us could all live together. We could be a family. Petey smiled. Yeah, I'd like that. But I'd miss Gram and Gramp. Dora nodded. Won't you miss your mom, Alan? Alan looked down at the whiskey bottle in his hands. I don't know. She's been a zombie ever since He trailed off, but he didn't need to finish. Both Dora and Petey knew, but there was a whole lot more Alan didn't say. He didn't tell them he thought it was his fault his dad died, and that he was afraid his mom thought so too. That maybe it should have been Alan who died in that fire. And sometimes, Alan wished it was. But Alan didn't say any of that. Instead, he swallowed hard, tears stinging his eyes. Petey wrapped Alan in a fierce hug, then so did Dora. Held tight in his friend's arms, Alan watched Petey's fireflies twinkle like tiny stars in their jam jar. He wished then that he could bottle up that moment like those bugs and keep it forever. One endless, perfect summer night. But time, dear listener, doesn't work like that. Even as he was thinking it, Alan could already feel the moment slipping away, and something else took its place. The air around them suddenly felt strange and heavy, and it wasn't the humidity. The kids let go of each other and looked around, searching for something, when a guttural noise came from the dark. It resonated around them like the swamp itself had come alive. Alan scanned the trees and saw it. 2 perfect circles shining in the dark. The eyes. But this time they were bigger, and they didn't just glow, but burned, smoldering in the dark swamp like 2 lanterns, flames dancing in the hollow sockets. Alan froze. He knew why they looked different. They were closer. The eyes got bigger and bigger. The shadows shifted. The kids couldn't move. They could hardly breathe, when something burst from the swamp. It was a feral boar, but something was profoundly wrong with this creature. It was pitch black and massive, as large as a grizzly with those 2 enormous eyeballs glowing out of its ugly head. Its expression was so wild that it looked deranged. Then it unhinged its mouth and squealed like 1,000 tortured pigs, and fled for their lives as the boar charged after them. They ran harder than they ever had. But if you've ever jogged on the beach, you know there are few things more futile than running in the sand. And 4 legs were a hell of a lot better at it than 2. Alan looked back to see the demon boar was gaining on them when he landed face down on the beach. Alan flipped over to see the black boar looming over him. Its bony tusks gleamed, curling to sharpened points. Yards away, Petey and Dora screamed at Alan to run, but he was trapped. Alan began to hyperventilate as the boar opened its rancid mouth. Hot saliva dripped from its snout into Alan's face, its eyes searing into him. Alan braced himself to be gored or eaten or worse when the boar froze and sniffed the air. Its head snapped to the right where just feet away, Alan's mom's whiskey was spilling in the sand. Above him, the boar grunted, then rushed toward the bottle. Alan jumped to his feet and sprinted to Dora and Petey, and as he glanced back, he could have swore the thing was licking up the booze. The kids fled into the swamp. They wove through trees, dodging logs and roots. Minutes later, they heard that rattling gurgle echo behind them. The boar was catching up. That's when Alan had a terrifying realization. There was nowhere to go. I don't know if you believe in fate, but regardless of what you call it, some unknowable force was at work that night. Because after trekking miles of swampy wilderness, the kids encountered something of a miracle. A house. It stood in a clearing bathed in moonlight, a ramshackle little place but a home nonetheless, with a front door painted in vibrant blue. The low groaning grew louder. The trio ran into the clearing and rushed to the porch. All three pounded on the cabin door, begging to be let in. When Alan looked behind them, standing at the tree line was not the black boar, but something else. It was scrawny and crooked with long limbs draped in rags. It reminded Alan of a scarecrow, not a person, but an imitation of one. But the biggest tell were its eyes. They were stretched too wide, too round, and gleaming in the dark. The boar had changed shape. Alan turned and banged on the door, screaming. They all were. When it opened, the kids scrambled inside. "It wasn't a boar," Alan cried. "It wasn't a..." Alan's words died in his throat, and his eyes went wide. They were standing in a dark hut, and illuminated in lantern light was an old woman. Her silver hair grew wild around her face, and her neck was adorned in cowrie shells. All three kids were thinking the same thing, but only Petey was dumb enough to say it. You're the little pale witch," she cackled, revealing blackened teeth. "I ain't no witch, and that out there ain't no animal. It's something nastier, something you can't kill." "Why not?" Alan asked warily. The old woman grinned. "'Cause you can't kill what's already dead." She turned, eyes flickering in the lamplight. "And nothing deader or more wretched than a Plat-Eye." The little pale witch would soon tell our heroes a terrible story, a twisted tale about things that happened in that strange swamp and the tortured souls that still lingered there. But to hear it, you'll have to wait for the next episode of Run, Fool. Run, Fool is a production of Ballen Studios, Campside Media, and At Will Media. It is hosted and executive produced by me, Rodney Barnes. This episode was written by Alex Garland and produced by Abakar Adan and Lee Mengistu. Editing by Abakar Adan. Sound director, designer, and mixer is Kevin Seaman. And artwork by Jessica Clarkston-Kiner. Production support by Jeremy Bone and Cole Lacasio. Special thanks to our operations team, Doug Slaywin, Ashley Warren, Sabina Mara, and Destiny Dingle. Executive producers at Ballen Studios are MrBallen, Nick Witters, and Zach Levitt. Executive producers at Will Media are Will Malnati and Rosie Guerin. Executive producers at Campside Media are Matt Scher, Josh Dean, Vanessa Gregoriadis, and Adam Hoff. Thanks for listening, and see you next week.